Okay, great. Thank you so much to Betsy and Jeff for joining us today to lead this SASB conversation. We're so excited at Impact Capital Forum to have you and to host this event and to share awareness and impact that the SASB is having to date. Just a quick opportunity to introduce Impact Capital Forum. Impact Capital Forum is a membership organization where we focus on helping to share information in the marketplace on issues related to impact investing, sustainable investing, microfinance, and social enterprises. So today we're lucky to focus on SASB and have the fortunate opportunity of Jeff, who's written this wonderful paper, which we can learn leaps and bounds and figure out how to apply in the private market context. We do have a few upcoming events as well. Opportunity zones has been an interesting focus for us at Impact Capital Forum. So we have the opportunity to speak with a traditional real estate investor who is working on sustainable real estate projects in opportunity zones. So Greg will be joining us for a conversation on February 11th to share his projects. And for those of you who are chomping at the bit to execute more OZ projects, it'd be a great opportunity to learn from him hands-on. Then we have this, later in February, we have an opportunity to learn more about how analysts are pricing in climate risks into financial markets. We have a great agenda here with leaders in the space who are really helping to figure out what the right price is to figure out how to price climate risk into financial markets with Eliza Eubank at Citi and the panel will be moderated by Jeff Gitterman at Gitterman. So we're excited for that event. And we also have another Opportunity Zone event coming up by who I like to call the grandfather of Opportunity Zones, although he prefers to be referred to as the architect of the OZ legislation, Steve Glickman, and Ira Weinstein, who recently published a book on the practical implications in making Opportunity Zones work from a practical perspective. So we're really excited to have and host Steve and Ira, the experts in this space. It's an opportunity to get some free advice on how to execute opportunity zones. And recently there's been some IRS legislation to offer increased timing opportunities for opportunity zones to work. So we'll be hearing hot off the presses, sort of the update from IRS and Treasury in Washington. And then in March right now, we have a virtual networking lunch planned, which is an opportunity to meet other members within the organization and to network and to sort of share the projects you're working on, and for job seekers to look for opportunities. So we really try to encourage a broad, diverse of conversation that arises. We are also not listed on our current events page, but we are also launching 2 additional working groups focused on, one is impact investing in Africa, related and to particular SDGs that have been enumerated by the group. So we will be launching that. We will be hosting 2 launch events, in February and March. And so if anyone's interested in that, please do feel free to email us at info@impactcapitalforum.org. And we are also working on a gender lens working group to launch that also later in February. So if any of those are interest, please do email us for additional information. So with that, I will shift the focus back to Jeff and Betsy. So Jeff has recently published this interesting paper discussing integrating ESG holistically in private equity as strategic support. So we're so excited to have the opportunity to really dig in. Personally, it was an excuse for me to really focus in on the report and hold me accountable to reading the report. So that's how the genesis of this conversation spawned. And I'm so excited that the rest of you have find this interesting and scintillating too. So we're so lucky to have Betsy, who is intimately familiar with the report and Jeff's work, to help us really break down how we can really apply this report in a practical perspective and what it means in the broader context. So Betsy, we're so lucky to have Betsy today, who is a special counsel at Orrick. She co-leads Orrick's global business and human rights practices and is a sustainability advisor. Betsy helps clients navigate the legal, business, and reputational risks of their biggest human rights and ESG challenges. With strong ties to the human rights and sustainability communities and her expertise in international human rights law, ESG, responsible and ethical technology and innovation, the SDGs and CSR, Betsy works with clients to develop an approach that considers peer benchmarking, but is tailored to their individual needs. Betsy has a particular passion for tackling human rights issues raised by emerging technologies and serves as co-chair for the World Economic Forum's Responsible Use of Technology Learning and Education Initiative. So I will pass the reins along to Betsy, and thank you all for joining us today.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm excited to be here with Jeff today. And although Jeff needs no introduction, I will give one anyway, since I got a long one myself. Jeff is the Director of Capital Markets Integration at SASB and also heads the private investment initiatives. What does that mean? It means that Jeff partners with institutional investors and asset owners, helping to facilitate dialogue on financially material, industry-specific ESG topics. He's going to talk more about that, but I'm really excited to dive into this report. But first, I would be remiss if we didn't address the front page news this morning from Larry Fink's newest letter, calling on companies to reduce or eliminate their carbon emissions by 2050, as well as a number of other things. So Jeff, when you took a look at that letter this morning, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. Great to be here, and thanks, Carolyn, for having me as usual. And I didn't know that the secret, the true motivation behind this was for you to read the report. That's good to know.
Holds me accountable to SASB.
Yeah, I mean, we're really grateful to Larry Fink and his team for not only their commitment to a number of different ESG initiatives, but thinking about carbon emissions reductions, but also his very strong encouragement and promotion of companies to disclose consistent with the SASB standards and the TCFD. He made a similar assertion last year. He's sort of, I wouldn't say doubling down, but really reaffirming those commitments at BlackRock. We've seen very similar commitments by other organizations like State Street Global Advisors, the Maple 8, which are the 8 largest pension systems in Canada, and many other really prominent and large asset owners and investors who are really taking up a really important role in influencing the adoption and sort of integration of sustainability related standards and disclosure, which is not only relevant in public markets, but of course in private markets as well. So obviously, whenever Larry Fink talks, the market listens. So we're always very pleased when he is promoting the work that we do at SASB.
Yep, great. Thanks, Jeff. So let's zoom in on your report now. And for those who haven't read it yet, I definitely encourage you to do so. Integrating ESG holistically in private equity, a strategic approach. When Jeff and I first discussed this report in the fall, I told him that I sent it to clients all the time when they had questions about kind of, what is ESG? What are all the frameworks? I can't make sense of it. So Jeff, you'll do a better job than I. Can you give us a quick 30-second soundbite? What is this report?
Sure. So ultimately, the goal for putting this report together in the first place was to address the very needs that your clients have expressed to you, Betsy, which is, I can't make sense of this space. I need to figure out what to do. How can I take this forward? So in the way that I approached this was outlining and defining what are the relevant components within the ESG ecosystem, and then which of those components are most relevant to a private markets investor, and then how you can apply those components interchangeably throughout the closed-end fund lifecycle, from diligence to post-investment operational support, reporting, and then ultimately communicating vis-a-vis fundraising. So defining, demystifying the ecosystem, and then applying it to a conventional investment process, and really helping GPs sift through the morass of ESG organizations that are out there, which all do great work, but arguably some have very limited scopes and limited application for a private equity investor. I don't know if that was 30 seconds. I might have gone over.
It was about right, maybe 40. That's great. One of the things that you do early on in the report is you cite to a number of statistics about how sustainability related information has become more and more important to investors. I think this will be a surprise to no one in this meeting. But why do you think that's happening now? Why, you've been in this area for many, many years. Why do you see that uptick happening now?
Great question. And ultimately, it's, I think, a convergence of a number of factors. One is there is really an overwhelming body of academic evidence that supports the connection between performance on ESG related issues and a company's ability to achieve strong financial performance. And it's gotten to the point where it's not just a few studies here and there, it's meta studies with sample sizes of in the thousands. So you could sort of poke holes in any methodology of an individual study, but there's so many out there that it's really hard to argue. That, I think, has become increasingly understood and adopted in the marketplace. That's one factor. Another factor is investors, asset owners, from high net worth individuals all the way up to pension systems, increasingly are recognizing this. And not only are they recognizing the connection to the ability to derive enterprise value creation, but there is really a fundamental attitudinal shift around wanting to ensure that investments at a minimum are not doing harm. And this idea of stakeholder capitalism, particularly in Europe, but is also permeating into other markets, where wanting to understand what exactly these factors, how these factors are being incorporated, assessed as part of the investment process, as well as part of being a good steward in the respective geography for which you operate, or markets in which you're investing, is also becoming of interest. And then finally, it's purely from a competitive differentiation standpoint. This is a great opportunity for fund managers to be able to demonstrate their expertise in a field that can add value, that can demonstrate positive societal and environmental impact. And oh, by the way, there's regulation coming down the pike in Europe that will likely create competitive dynamics even for those that aren't marketing in Europe. But Betsy, you know that far better than I do. So it's this sort of coalescing and sort of converging of multiple really significant megatrends in the space, that ultimately it's sort of really pushing the agenda and making it such that this information is becoming table stakes, and incorporating it is really the sign of good investment practice.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier on that your report helps to demystify the ESG ecosystem. And to me, that really was one of the most helpful elements of it. You start by naming all the different frameworks that are out there and trying to make sense of them and which one fits in where. But ultimately, you end up saying, look, this is a jungle out there of ESG frameworks. Let me tell you about the ones that are the most important to know about. Can you walk us through that at a high level? Which ones did you identify and why?
Yeah, absolutely. And by no means is the report comprehensive, right? This doesn't capture everything that's out there. It attempts to highlight the majority of them. But if you think about what are the things that occur most often and are most relevant to many different types of private equity investors, both returns first, regular way buyout shops, as well as in many cases impact oriented investors, it really boils down to, I think, 4 organizations in addition to the work that SASB does. That's the work that the UNPRI does. That's the TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. It's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and it's the Impact Management Project. You could certainly throw in many other initiatives that are really important, like IRIS Plus and GRESB for real assets and infrastructure. But to sort of assess the breadth of the industry, I really wanted to focus on those 4. And definitionally speaking, I think it's really important to sort of take a step back and understand what these 4 organizations and or initiatives do, because they're not all organizations, right? For instance, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure is focused exclusively as is in the name, on climate. And it creates high-level principles for how to think about assessing, strategizing for, and measuring and setting thresholds towards identifying climate-related risks and opportunities, and how physical transition and regulatory risks might impact companies. That's not even an organization. It's an initiative that was sort of the outcome of a task force. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are not an organization. They are high-level goals that are designed for more than just the investors, but consumers, governments, multilateral organizations, really just sort of all sort of different participants here in society, and how we can get to a place where we are achieving sustainable development, some of which are not even investable themes.
Mhm.
And then there are specific organizations like the Impact Management Project and the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. One focused very much on achieving positive societal and environmental outcome, and the PRI being more about incorporating ESG principles into an investment process. So if you think about that on a continuum, and I'm sure many of you have seen this sort of continuum, various continuum slides that are out there. PRI does a great job around integrating ESG factors, but also touches on some impact factors. And then they have guidance on TCFD, they have guidance on the SDGs. The IMP can be achieved through the SDGs, and then SASB connects with all of them. So part of what I was trying to do, and I'm not doing a great job explaining it right now, is demonstrating some of the various interconnections between these 5 organizations, largely sort of with SASB at its core, because to achieve the guidance from frameworks and principles, you need specific data and information that is consistent and comparable and financially material. And that's where SASB helps bring to light all of this information. I've noticed a couple of questions in chats around where the report is available, so I'm just going to throw that into the chat box so that you all can download it if you're so inclined.
Yeah, and I would say that the graphics you have in there, I think if we, if you pull up the graphics for the participants alongside what Jeff's saying, it'll make total sense to you. So you do in the report, you talk about, well, you focus on, how you teach us how we can integrate SASB, right? But you do also talk about how SASB overlaps and interacts with these other frameworks. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about that, focusing on SASB and how it interacts with the other frameworks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll sort of just walk through an example. So in March of last year, the UNPRI produced a report that is guidance for private equity general partners on how to incorporate the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. And they break it down into 4 buckets. 3 of those buckets, strategy, activity, metrics, and sort of, thinking about various different climate scenarios, can be achieved through the integration of SASB specific data.
Did we lose you, Jeff?
I don't know what just happened there. I apologize. I got kicked off.
That's okay, you're back.
Right back in. Just to go back to the example, they outline various questions, the PRI does, that a GP can ask to its potential portfolio companies around their exposure to various climate-related issues. Now, the reality is, depending on what industry you're in, be it metals and mining, be it healthcare delivery, be it consumer packaged goods, the nature of the environmental issues will vary. For instance, ecological impacts are much more likely to be a material issue to metals and mining companies than it would be consumer packaged goods companies, depending on the nature of their operations. So it really puts a finer lens on some of these broad-based questions around climate that are cited in that report. So that's one way you can take very specific high-level guidance from the PRI around TCFD and action it into effective due diligence that can turn into collection of useful KPIs upon investment in a company that one can manage to, and thinking about developing best practices around sourcing specific ingredients, or ensuring that employee health and safety is not sort of impacted adversely by various extreme weather events. All of those are sort of the really specific details that SASB can help action. So hopefully that sort of brings to light a bit an example. And in the report, I walk through an example, basically soup to nuts, from an agricultural standpoint, and how SASB sort of brings to light these various components throughout the deal phase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is one of the things that I also found really helpful about the report, is that you do talk about how to integrate SASB and just ESG generally through every step of the deal phase. And maybe you can walk it, because I think people oftentimes think that there's just like one moment in time where they need to pay attention to these factors, right? And analyze it. So I think what's helpful is you take us through kind of the life cycle and explain, all the different moments in time where we need to be thinking about ESG and integrating it. Can you walk us through that kind of deal cycle and in all of those moments?
Yeah, absolutely. So the majority of GPs who are integrating ESG or impact considerations really do it in due diligence, and then they sort of that's it, they're done. At least that's a common starting place, and some continue and push it forward, which is what I highlight in the paper, and some deem it to be sufficient. But the reality is you're owning this asset or this company for anywhere from 3 to 7 years, and there is the opportunity, either through your operating partners or through your participation on the board, to influence company management around financially material ESG issues, whereby you are either protecting against certain risk factors or capturing new opportunities. So it's not just a CYA exercise up front to make sure there are no red flags. That's certainly something you want to do in due diligence, but then you're wasting an opportunity to add value during ownership. And if you think about the nature of exits, the majority of exits go to not IPO, that's oftentimes rare, but a purchase from a strategic public company or a larger strategic corporation. These companies, going back to the Think letter, are under increasing scrutiny by investors, increasing amounts of guidance and regulatory pressures to share and disclose ESG information. And now if they have a supply chain that goes down into the private markets, they may be affected irrespective of how they exit. But if they are to be purchased by a public strategic and they're already collecting and managing to these issues, and they can then add that to the way in which they communicate to their investor base, all else equal, that's something that creates additional synergies and is valuable. I won't suggest that it adds an enormous amount to the multiple on exit, but it's one of those factors that can be extremely valuable in a negotiated exit, and adding value to not only the sponsor that is owning that company, but to the extent that original company management still has an ownership stake. Most of the time they still do. They'll be very interested in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Your point about capturing opportunities as well as managing risks really resonates with me, because I feel like that's something in the legal industry we tend to focus heavily on the risk part of it, and not fully understanding the opportunities that our clients could both see and or could realize by integrating ESG. So I appreciate that point. We have a number of impact investors on the call. I'm wondering if there's anything in particular you want the impact community to take away from your report.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've really spent a lot of time on recently, and hopefully that one of the themes that gets teased out in this report, is there is a convergence between ESG and impact. And I'll just sort of define how I define the two, and everyone sort of uses these definitions somewhat differently. ESG is simply information. right? It is information pertaining to a company's operations that is either impacting or affected by environmental, social, and governance related issues. The management of ESG related issues not only affects a company's financial returns, but can have the opportunity to either reduce negative externalities or contribute positively to societal and environmental impacts. If you're to take the, I guess the most, the broadest approach to it, in the sense that how can I achieve impact and invest across all market sectors? You would have to have a more expansive view of what it means to have impact. And in that way, the reduction of negative externalities would need to be sort of encompassed in that definition. Otherwise, you would very understandably and appropriately eliminate oil and gas and eliminate various other industries that for the most part are not producing very good societal or environmental outcomes, period. However, they could be operating in a way that facilitates a just transition, that reduces the negative impacts that they're having as they're changing their business mix and moving to a more renewables-oriented portfolio, for instance. So the reason I say all of this is not to put a judgment on what is or is not impact. A lot of that can be very subjective in nature. Or the importance of one could be more important to another person depending on what their value system is or who they're trying to affect. Simply that the likelihood of achieving impact can be greater scaled if you are communicating to investors that these are core operational issues that can allow you to reduce risk or capture opportunities. And oh, by the way, achieve various positive environmental and social impacts. That's where the connection between the SASB standards, which are rooted in a connection to financial materiality and enterprise value creation, link to the sustainable development goals at the target level. We have an individual report specifically on this connection, where an investor could understand, okay, these are the issues that are core to my portfolio company's operations. And these issues have the ability to affect these specific SDG targets. Now, if I action upon that information post-investment, that is where you can credibly demonstrate as a regular way private equity investor or an impact investor that your actions are, and tracked by KPIs, contributing to specific outcomes as communicated by the SDGs. And most of the impact investors on here know that the SDGs are widely accepted goals and aspirations by many in the investment community, though they're not the only way that you can communicate impact. As I alluded to earlier, the IFC operating principles, the IRIS Plus metrics, and there are many other ways one can communicate impact. But increasingly, the SDGs, at least from my experience working with many investors, are a very widely accepted and commonly appreciated framework by which to communicate this.
Thanks, Jeff. And also very widely accepted and referenced in the human rights community as well. I mentioned before, I think one of the things the legal industry does wrong is not focusing enough on the opportunities that ESG can bring. With years of experience in this space, what are people doing wrong in integrating ESG? What do you think we need to focus on doing? And maybe a better way to put it, what do you think we need to focus on doing better, in particular in kind of the private equity sphere?
That's a great question. And I don't know that it's sort of on the legal community to foster this. I mean, I think pointing it out is certainly something that anyone in any sort of area within an investment organization can facilitate. But you're focused on the things that potentially create liabilities for your clients, and that's what you should be focused on. But ultimately, ESG will always be considered a potential liability or a risk mitigating issue if it only lives within the compliance department or the legal department within a fund management's operations. That's not holistic integration. And holistic integration means not just across the life cycle of a deal, but it also means across the various departments within an organization. One thing I've seen often is ESG just living in the quote unquote cost centers within various fund management operations. That is one example. If it just lives within investor relations, where they just want to have potentially useful answers to questions from LPs, then it's not necessarily being integrated by the deal team. The risk team isn't taking a close look at this. So in order to capture the opportunities, it's important that whoever is leading the charge, the internal ESG or impact champion within a specific fund, really can help to try to foster communication amongst their colleagues to demonstrate, hey, this is not just a downside issue, and this is not just something we need to do, and that we can charge back to the fund and sort of just think about it as a necessary cost. This is an opportunity to differentiate the enterprise and also add value to the investment companies. Just a specific example, thinking about the growth in organic foods brands that you all have seen at your Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and wherever it is y'all shop or get delivered nowadays. The multiples being paid by big process and foods and consumer packaged goods companies for organically marketed and sort of organically derived product is astronomical. This is something that I addressed with my colleague Gail Glazerman in an article we did in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance. And thinking about an opportunity, that is a great opportunity to capture this growing market and diversify your revenue stream. So that's just one specific example, but there are lots of others out there. And if you actually boil down the SASB standards, about 30% of the SASB standards speak to opportunities, not just potential risk issues.
And for those kind of listening in to this meeting right now, if they want to help their organizations understand these things better and become better, what practically can people do, after they get off this call to do that?
Well, of course, it's immediately read the report, right? No, look, I think that that's part of the reason I wrote it, is to try to make it accessible. It doesn't need to be read straight through. There can be bits and pieces that can be applied in a stepwise fashion. But ultimately, it's just changing the conversation, right? If it's viewed purely through, okay, we have to do this because XYZ LP is asking, then you are sort of inhibiting your ability to really capture the opportunities that are available to the organization. There are so many resources out there that it can actually be somewhat overwhelming, but I would suggest that anyone on this call or otherwise that would be interested in educating their colleagues or putting useful resources in the hands of their contemporaries in the space, really just focus on, how does this all start? It starts with a policy. There's amazing resources out there. BSR is one that comes to mind immediately, but the PRI as well. How do you write a policy? Great free resources, right? I'm emphasizing this, free resources. A policy is written, potentially, reviewed with your friendly folks at Orrick to make sure that it's buttoned up from a legal standpoint. Then how do you start actioning upon it? SASB has written this report. Many others have put out guidance, free guidance available to be accessed. So this idea of this is an extensive cost really is not necessarily true, but I would also just throw out one other thing. Much like many years ago, there didn't used to be in-house compliance professionals or in-house legal professionals or in-house risk professionals. Well, the amount of staffing growth amongst ESG specialists has grown, I think, in one EY report, over 35%. And that was mostly in Europe. But if you look at what PitchBook has done, and they did a sort of survey of the same thing, similar staffing growth, not at the same clip, but more and more folks are thinking, okay, we need someone to manage this holistically. So it starts with changing the attitude. It starts with, where do we get the policy right? And then leveraging these free market resources, and then building that trust and that understanding, like, oh, this is eminently achievable. Then the resource allocation comes from, whoever's controlling the purse strings there. And then you can really turbocharge your efforts.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. You mentioned earlier kind of Europe leading the charge in terms of potential regulations. Here in the US, we do have a new administration. What do you expect to see in the next 4 years from a Biden administration on ESG related issues?
Great question. Hard to say at this point, but I can just say that politics aside, purely from ESG incorporation and relevance, this is an incredibly exciting new chapter in the sense that we have received inbound inquiries from a number of senators and Congress people. We have received inquiries from the SEC and many others that want to learn more about sustainability disclosure. And it's just going to be more data, more recognition. The DOL statement is sort of ebbed and flowed based on the administration. It'll probably ebb back again. I don't know how or in what way, but it won't necessarily take on the same momentum and sort of ferocity as is in Europe, but it is absolutely coming. And the sort of acceptance and understanding around this will be really exciting. So just keep your eyes peeled because it's going to happen fast, especially, given midterm elections and wanting to get on top of this from at least the Biden administration perspective.
Yeah, I know amongst many of my clients, they're keeping an eye on potential SEC disclosure requirements coming down the pipeline on ESG. Okay, well, I'd like to open it up to questions from participants, but before I do so, Jeff, perhaps you can share with us, kind of your 3 things that you want us to take away from this report or this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I guess first, this is a system, right? So anyone that says, well, there needs to be just one set of standards and rules that just takes care of all of it, it ain't gonna happen. But what will happen is a simpler single system, which the parts of which are more easily understood and communicated and accessible and leveraged. This is just the sign of a mature marketplace where there are many actors performing different functions within a system in order to make it operate efficiently. So that's one really important takeaway, and it's highlighted in part in the report. Secondarily, there is great work by many organizations. I didn't even get the opportunity yet to mention the work of the British Venture Capital Association or the CDC Group, or even what the Institutional Limited Partners Association is doing in regards to their D&I roadmap and various ESG related initiatives. A lot of folks are doing a lot of great things, but unless the initiative that you are looking at, whether it's those or others, touches on core aspects of the investment process, it will always have limited relevance. So seeking the interoperability and relevance of whatever the initiative may be, or the framework, or the standards, or the guidance, whatever it may be seeking to achieve, is of the utmost importance. And then finally, this is not a costs center. That is the wrong way to think about this. This is an opportunity. This is the new way investors expect these opportunities to be analyzed and communicated to. And anyone that sort of stays in that mindset will eventually get left behind. Now, they could be great investors. I'm not suggesting that they would be bad investors by not thinking about it this way, but it's just a massive opportunity that would be missed if they stay in that mindset of, we just need to minimize this cost and sort of just appease specific bodies that are asking, because that questions and the requests will only keep growing, particularly with this new regulation and new understanding of how financially material this information truly is.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. At this point, I would like to open it up to questions. Feel free to, I think this functionality works, to raise your hand and I can call on you.
Betsy, you're also seeing the questions in the Q&A, right? If not, I can chat them to you.
Yeah, here we go. I'll go ahead and read these out. So the first one, what can the investment community do to speed up adoption of SASB reporting?
Yeah, and I think I partially addressed this, and there's many different ways that it can be achieved depending on where you sit within the investment community. But we have engagement resources that can allow investors to reach out to their portfolio companies, public or private, and have these conversations, educating colleagues, companies, et cetera, on the financial relevance so that you don't have to appeal to an individual's set of values. You appeal to their understanding of IRR. And that is always incredibly powerful because values can be subjective. So having a plain business conversation using SASB tools, which is a synthesis of the market, can be a really powerful way to achieve the acceptance and adoption of the SASB standards. And to the extent that anyone would like some guidance on which resources to leverage, I know we have a lot of information. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Jeff. We have another question. SASB is integrating with another international group. Can you talk about that? And a group of 5 or so that have agreed to cooperate and harmonize formally. If you could talk a bit more about those efforts and any timeline that exists for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in December, SASB and the Integrated Reporting Framework announced an intent to merge. Will likely complete in Q2 of this year. In thinking about that system, they are principles-based guidance around communicating sustainability-related information that ties to enterprise value creation. And then SASB are the specific metrics that can help communicate those principles. So we're very complementary from where we sit within the system. Secondarily, we're complementary from a geographic standpoint. They have great success in Europe and they're headquartered over in the UK. SASB has presence in Europe, but also, we got our starts here in the States and have much more market share and awareness in the States. In addition, we're sort of responding to the market's desire to harmonize the space. So this was sort of checked a lot of boxes, and sort of the fit organizationally and culturally in the various work that we're doing made a ton of sense to make things easier for both issuers and investors to make sense of how sustainability disclosure can be integrated into an investment process. There was also a component of that question around the Group of 5 joint statement. For those of you that are not familiar, that's SASB, the IRC, CDP, CDSB, and GRI, all committing to continuing, this is the important word, continuing to work together to harmonize the field. So where that will start will be around climate-related issues, sort of demonstrating the interconnectedness of the various things that we're doing around climate. We're working on several reports now, some of which will come out soon, some of which will be released in COP26, whether virtually or in person in Glasgow. We'll see, what happens with COVID. But this is just reflective of another step in the direction of harmonizing the field and making it more user-friendly and making the system simpler to interpret and to utilize. So Kim, I hope that answered your question.
And Jeff, this is a question for me, follow up. What more do you think that the various organizations with frameworks and standards and principles, what more do you think can be done to harmonize beyond what's kind of currently happening?
That's a great question. I think that just more of what is being done is just, it's being demanded by the market. I mean, ultimately, the sign of any growing and maturing market is limited barriers to entry. Everyone sort of goes and does their own thing. Eventually, certain things sort of rise and emerge. There's consolidation, and then a few sort of prominent players sort of begin to really sort of dictate market conditions. And that's both in the for-profit and in the NGO space. So you're seeing that maturation. there's a lot of collaboration that the various groups are doing with the IFRS Foundation and various responses to regulatory consultation periods as well. But we just need to get more tangible, demonstrating the interoperability. That was part of the reason behind the paper. We need to be thematic in how we do it. So climate, how it affects human capital issues, how it affects really important engagement, employee engagement related issues beyond sort of your workforce health and safety, which is obviously of the utmost importance now. So just getting more granular and thematic in the practical way that this can be applied, I think is really important. So I think that this is great progress. There just needs to be more of the work.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here. How does this all tie into promoting the conversation around stakeholder capitalism?
Yeah, so I mentioned that briefly just as an alternative perspective that would, and stakeholder capitalism is sort of more all encompassing, right? So there are multiple stakeholders, there are investors, employees, customers, local communities, et cetera. And so thinking about the impact lens, that's really where, having an impact lens is really important. And stakeholder capitalism is really much more embraced in Europe than it is in the States. But it's just sort of thinking about your corporate activity more holistically amongst the various stakeholders. So I guess the point I was trying to make when I mentioned stakeholder capitalism was that you can use pure capitalistic information to convey to other stakeholders through these interconnections to things like the SDGs and the impact management project. In the future, we're going to do a conceptual high-level connection to Iris Plus and the work we're doing in conjunction with the Group of Five and GRI. That's where you can take financially relevant information and convey that to a broader set of stakeholders. So if that wasn't clear, hopefully that clarified.
Thanks, Jeff. So we have a question here that you have the opportunity to skip it if you'd like. Given that opportunity was granted by the question asker. What do you think about impact-weighted accounts at Harvard Business School?
I read the report. I found it fascinating. I admit that it was several months ago that I read it, so I'm going to politely pass on opining further. But I did find it to be incredibly different, but also different in maybe a really good way. My initial reaction was I was struggling to see where a lot of the initial work of a lot of great institutions would plug into impact-weighted accounts, but maybe that wasn't the intent of Professor Serafim and his colleagues in producing it. So those were my initial reactions. I found it fascinating, but I was sort of reading it with a very specific lens in mind. So I'll just leave it there.
Picking up off of that, Jeff, what are some trends that you see or kind of new things that are happening in the space that you think are going to pick up in popularity? I hesitate to call them trends because, I think all of this is here to stay, right? But what are some kind of individual things that are happening that you think are really going to gain steam in the year ahead?
Yeah, I guess a few things. There will be more and more, and I alluded to this earlier, dedicated ESG specialists within investment houses. It may not explode in growth, but it's happening more and more. I'm seeing it all the time. Such that it used to just be there was a very senior person and a very junior person. But now it's gotten to the point where there are people of all stages of their career that are able to occupy ESG related roles in investment organizations. So I think that that's a really encouraging sign. Data, buzzwords. I joke that if you just say, and you live out in the Bay Area, Betsy, if you just say machine learning, AI, and natural language processing all together, and it doesn't need to make sense, you'll get funding. But the reality is, you can't just rely on what the company says about themselves, particularly in the public markets. And being able to thoughtfully and through technology get access to that information through a reputable lens like a SASB to be able to analyze holistically and through a mosaic approach how this information can be sensitized, both from a public and a private market context, is really, really powerful. And these tools are incredible. So I think that that's going to be here to stay as well, like data and then increase, but not perfect transparency in the private markets. More and more service providers to GPs are emerging with very helpful use cases to ease the burden of collecting this information, such that all of the different items I highlight in the report can actually be achieved consistent with conventional reporting requirements. So I would highlight those three.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, we are up we have the few minutes left, but this has been a very rewarding conversation with you. I felt very pleased to have the opportunity to continue our conversation from this fall. Do you have any final words that you want to leave us with?
No, just thank you, Carolyn. Thank you all for joining. I really always appreciate the opportunity to share this work. You know, a big part of what we're trying to do is just to grow this field, and to the extent that I can be helpful to you as agents of change, I'm very happy to be. So just thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Betsy.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Betsy and Jeff, on behalf of Impact Capital Forum. That was so great. So much. I always leave these conversations with more sort of footnotes that I need to research and think about. So it just gives me more research and thinking to do in terms of digging deeper into how we can really further and support your work, Jeff, and integration of impact measurement into it. Is a hot topic du jour. So how we can really further and push the needle. So we're excited to see your merger with IRRC and see what new opportunities that could bring. So hopefully we will talk to you and check in after that occurs. And thank you so much, Betsy and Jeff, and to everyone for joining us today and for these great questions.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.